It was a rainy afternoon in the small town, and the streets were quiet with few people walking around. A soft mist hung in the air as an elderly woman named Margaret Hayes made her way down the street, her shoes clicking against the wet pavement. She had walked this path many times before, but today her steps felt heavier than usual. The weight of time had taken its toll on her body, but not her spirit. Margaret wore a faded blue coat that had seen better days. It wasn't the finest coat, but it was hers, and she wore it with pride. She carried a small purse tightly in her hand, clutching it close to her chest as though protecting the memories it held. Inside the purse were small treasures, a photograph of her late husband, a few coins, and a note from her son, James, that she would read over and over whenever she felt alone. The small restaurant stood just ahead, nestled on the corner of the E Street, its warm lights spilling out into the rain. Margaret had been coming to this place for years. It had changed names over time, but she remembered when it was just a little diner. It was where she and her husband had dreamed of one day owning their own business. But life had other plans, and now it was her son James who owned the place. James had worked so hard to make it a success, and she couldn't be prouder of him, She stepped through the door. The bell above the entrance gave a soft jingle signaling her arrival. The young waiter behind the counter, a man named Tom, glanced up from his phone as Margaret entered. He was tall, with messy brown hair and a tired look on his face. When he saw her, his expression changed immediately. He quickly put his phone away and wiped his hands on his apron, but his frown remained. He took one look at her and then looked away as though not wanting to acknowledge her presence. Margaret didn't mind. She had seen this happen before. Older people sometimes weren't treated as kindly as younger ones. She had learned long ago to accept it, even if it stung a little. She smiled politely at the waiter, but he didn't smile back. Instead, he just gestured toward the empty tables and said, "We're full, sorry." Margaret paused for a moment, confused. The restaurant was nearly empty. She could see only a couple of people sitting by the windows, quietly sipping their drinks. She looked at the waiter again, trying to make sense of his words. "I have a reservation," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Under the name Hayes." Tom blinked, not recognizing the name. He glanced around the room, hoping to see a list or a note about the reservation, but there was nothing. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, then turned back to Margaret with an expression that was more impatient than apologetic. "Sorry," he said again, his voice a little sharper. "I said we're full. Maybe you should try somewhere else." Margaret felt a small pang in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had dealt with far worse things in her life. It was just the way people sometimes treated you when they didn't see you for who you really were. But Margaret was used to it. She had always been quiet and patient, never one to cause a fuss. With a simple nod, Margaret made her way toward the table in the corner. The chair creaked as she sat down. She didn't want to make a scene. She had come here for peace, for a quiet moment to enjoy her meal. She was used to dining alone, and she had learned to appreciate the solitude. The food was always good, and that was enough for her. She took out the photo from her purse, the one of her late husband and their young son James, standing outside the small diner they had once dreamed of running together. She looked at the picture for a moment, tracing her finger along the faces of the two people she loved most in the world. The picture was old, worn around the edges, but it still held the warmth of their smiles. The waiter, Tom, had already turned his back to her and was walking toward the kitchen. He didn't even spare her another glance. Margaret didn't mind. She knew the restaurant was busy, even if it didn't look like it. She wasn't upset with him. People had their own lives, their own struggles. It wasn't easy working in a restaurant, especially one like this. She placed the photo back in her purse and glanced around the room. The quiet hum of the air conditioning and the soft clinking of dishes filled the space. It was peaceful. She closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself to relax, imagining the life she had once shared with her husband. Those early days when they had cooked meals together and shared laughter in the kitchen. In those days, everything had felt possible. But now those dreams were just memories, and yet Margaret had kept going, kept moving forward even when things seemed impossible. Her son James had always been the light of her life. She had raised him to be strong, to believe in himself, and to chase his dreams. And he had done just that, opening a restaurant that had become a staple in their little town. Her heart swelled with pride as she thought of him. James had been through so much, and now, seeing him succeed, made all the sacrifices worth it. This was his dream, his hard work. And yet here she was, sitting alone in his restaurant, treated like she was invisible. It stung more than she expected, but Margaret kept her head high. She had learned long ago that not everyone would see her for who she truly was. Some people wouldn't take the time to understand, and that was okay. She had made her peace with that long ago. But as she sat there waiting for someone to notice her, she couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for people to see the value in everyone, not just those who were loud or young or seen as important? Margaret didn't know the answer, but she believed it was possible. She believed that one day, people would learn to see beyond the surface, and until then, she would keep moving forward, quietly, with grace. She took a deep breath and smiled, softly. It had been a long day, but she was content. She wasn't invisible. She knew who she was, and that was enough. The end years ago, Margaret Hayes had been the heart and soul of a small home in a quiet neighborhood. She was a woman of simple means, working hard every day to make sure her son, James, had everything he needed. After James's father passed away when he was just a boy, Margaret did everything she could to make sure he didn't feel the weight of their loss. She took on 2 jobs, waking early in the morning to clean houses, and then working late into the night at a small cafe. The work was tiring, but it was all for James. James had always been a dreamer. Even when he was a child, he would talk about opening a restaurant of his own. Margaret could remember those days like they were yesterday. He would sit at the dinner table, drawing pictures of the restaurant he wanted to run, asking her what it would be like. "It'll be a place where everyone is welcome," he would say, his eyes full of hope. "A place where people can come and feel at home." Margaret would smile at him and say, "If you work hard enough, you can make anything happen." She believed in him, even when things were tough. When James was accepted to a cooking school, Margaret didn't hesitate. She took on even more hours, cutting back on sleep just to cover the cost. She believed in his dream with all her heart. Even when the bills piled up and the exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders, after years of hard work, James finally opened the restaurant they had always talked about. The first few months were hard, but slowly things began to pick up. They had a small team of employees, and though they didn't have much, they had each other. Margaret often worked in the kitchen, helping to prepare the meals that would go out to the tables. She loved being a part of it all, but it was James's dream, not hers. She was proud of him, and her love for him shone through every dish she prepared. She could see the pride in his eyes every time he spoke about the restaurant, and it filled her heart with warmth. For a while it seemed like everything was perfect. The restaurant was becoming more popular. People in the town spoke highly of it. They loved the food, the atmosphere, and the welcoming spirit. James's dream was coming true, and Margaret was thrilled for him. But like all dreams, the road to success was not always easy. The hours were long and the bills never seemed to end. There were days when they barely made enough to cover the costs, and weeks when the stress seemed too much to bear. But they kept pushing forward, because that's what they did. They never gave up. Slowly, the restaurant grew. James hired more staff and the kitchen became busier. The customers kept coming back, and the restaurant became a beloved spot in their small town. People would come in for lunch or dinner, sit at the tables, and talk about their day. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place to connect, to share stories, and to find comfort in each other's company. James's dream had turned into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. But as the restaurant became more successful, something started to change. Margaret no longer worked in the kitchen as much. She helped out when she could. But as James took on more responsibility, she began to feel more like an observer than a part of the team. The restaurant that had been their shared dream now belonged to James. It wasn't that she minded. He had worked so hard to make it what it was. But she had spent so many years being the one who took care of everything, and now she felt a little lost. It wasn't just the work that had changed. It was the way people saw her. She had spent so many years serving others, whether it was in their home, at the cafe, or in the kitchen of the restaurant. But now she felt invisible. People would come into the restaurant and talk to James, praise him for his hard work and ask him for advice. Margaret would smile, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wasn't mad at James, she was proud of him. But she missed the days when she had been at the center of it all. Today, as she sat alone in the restaurant, waiting for her meal, that feeling of invisibility returned. She looked around the room and saw the customers chatting and laughing. The waiters moved quickly between the tables, their faces familiar, but none of them paid her any special attention. It was as if she were just another face in the crowd, someone they had seen before but didn't really know. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know her story. But it still stung. Margaret had always been the one who made things happen. She had always been the one who worked behind the scenes, making sure everything ran smoothly. But now, it felt as though the world had moved on without her. The restaurant was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, and James was at the helm. She was proud of him, but a part of her longed to feel like she mattered, to feel like she was still needed. As she sat at the table, quietly waiting for her food, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on the years that had passed. She remembered when James was just a boy, sitting at the kitchen table telling her about his dream. She remembered how she had worked so hard to make that dream come true. And she remembered the feeling of pride when James had finally opened the restaurant, the feeling that they had done something together, that they had built something from nothing. But now, sitting alone in the restaurant that had been their dream, she wondered if she was still part of it. The world had moved on, and she had been left behind. It wasn't easy, but Margaret had learned a long time ago that life wasn't always about being seen. Sometimes it was enough just to know that you had done your part, that you had helped someone else reach their dream. But today, as she sat there, feeling the weight of the years, the loneliness crept in, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like just a shadow in the place she had helped to build. The end. Message. Sometimes the hardest part of seeing others succeed is finding your place in their success. But even when we feel invisible, the work we do is never forgotten. As Margaret sat quietly at the corner table, the sound of conversation and clinking plates filled the air around her. The warm light from the lamps above cast a soft glow on the restaurant's simple decor, but Margaret hardly noticed. She had become lost in her own thoughts, reflecting on the years that had passed, the sacrifices she had made, and the son she had raised. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible, like the world had moved on and left her behind. It wasn't long before Richard, the restaurant manager, walked past her table. He had been busy in the kitchen earlier, preparing for the dinner rush, but as he glanced toward the dining room, his eyes froze when he saw Margaret sitting there. His face went pale, and his steps slowed as he tried to make sense of the situation. Margaret had been here for quite some time now, but he hadn't noticed her at all. Richard stopped in his tracks, his gaze shifting between Margaret and the waiters moving about the room. He didn't know what to say. A wave of realization hit him, and he felt a knot form in his stomach. The woman sitting quietly at the table wasn't just any customer. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. "Mrs. Hayes?" Richard finally asked, his voice laced with surprise. He took a careful step toward her, trying to hide the shock in his expression. What are you doing here?" Margaret looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that surprised him. She had been waiting patiently for her meal, but there was something about her presence that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I'm here for my reservation," she said, her voice steady but strong. "Under Hayes." Richard was silent for a moment. The name didn't immediately register, and he felt a strange unease in his chest. He turned toward Tom, the young waiter who had initially greeted Margaret when she arrived. Tom had been busy with his own tasks, but now Richard caught his eye, and the tension between them was clear. "Do you know who this is?" Richard asked quietly, his voice softer than usual, as if trying to keep the conversation private. His gaze stayed on Tom, waiting for an answer. Tom blinked, his face going red. He shifted awkwardly on his feet, glancing back at Margaret, then at Richard. "No," he said, his voice faltering. "She just came in and—" He stopped, realizing that his words didn't make much sense. His eyes widened as he looked at Margaret again, taking in the calmness of her demeanor, the quiet strength she carried. Something in his gut told him he had missed something important. Richard's expression turned serious, and he stepped closer to Tom. "This is James Hayes's mother," he said, his voice now full of respect. He glanced back at Margaret as if he were seeing her for the first time. "The owner of this restaurant, I had no idea she would be here today." Tom's face went white as the realization hit him. Margaret had been sitting there quietly, unnoticed by everyone, yet she was the very reason the restaurant existed. The woman he had just brushed off without a second thought was the heart and soul of the place. His embarrassment grew, and he could feel the heat rise in his cheeks. He had been rude, dismissive even, and now he understood just how wrong he had been. Richard turned back to Margaret, his expression now filled with a mix of surprise and regret. He had known James for years. He had worked side by side with him through the ups and downs of the restaurant business. But he had never taken the time to learn about the woman who had helped raise James, the one who had supported him from the very beginning. "Mrs. Hayes," Richard said, his voice softening. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry for how you've been treated. It was wrong. I should have known better." Margaret smiled gently, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "It's all right," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I don't need special treatment. I've seen the way things work around here." Richard stood there, unsure of what to say next. He felt a deep sense of regret. It wasn't just about the mistake with Margaret. It was about how easily he had taken things for granted. The restaurant was thriving, yes, but it had taken hard work, dedication, and a lot of love to get to this point. James had put his heart into it, and Margaret had put hers into him. Without them, this place wouldn't exist. And yet, in all, the busy days and long hours, he had forgotten to appreciate the people who had made it all possible. "James doesn't know I'm here today," Margaret said quietly, her voice low, almost to herself. "He's been busy with the kitchen. I didn't want to disturb him." Richard nodded slowly, understanding now just how much Margaret had always done in the background. She had never sought attention, never asked for praise. She had always supported James quietly behind the scenes. And yet as the restaurant grew, she had become a shadow unseen by most. "I'll make sure to take care of everything for you," Richard said, his tone filled with sincerity. "Please let me know if you need anything." Margaret nodded and smiled, the warmth in her eyes making Richard feel as though he had learned something important that day. He had learned that sometimes the people who make the biggest impact are the ones who go unnoticed. Margaret had worked so hard for so many years, yet she had never asked for anything in return. And now, when she could have demanded recognition, she had simply chosen to be quiet, to wait patiently in the background. Richard walked away, his mind heavy with the truth he had just uncovered. He couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. Margaret Hayes had given everything for her son, and her quiet strength was something that deserved to be recognized. As Richard disappeared into the kitchen, Margaret returned to her thoughts. She wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking attention. She was just a mother who had done her best, and today she would quietly enjoy her meal, knowing that her son had built something beautiful, something worth being proud of. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but hope that one day others would see her too, not just as a name, but as the person who had always been there, quietly supporting, quietly loving. The end. Message. Sometimes the most important people are the ones who go unnoticed. Their love and strength shape the world around them, even when no one sees it. Richard's face turned bright red as he realized the mistake he had made. He had known James for years and had always admired the restaurant's success, but he had never thought to ask about the woman who had made all of this possible. The woman sitting quietly at the table was James's mother, the heart behind the dream that had become their thriving restaurant. He quickly turned to Tom, who was still standing there looking uncomfortable. "You'll need to do better than this," Richard said, his voice sharp. "Mrs. Hayes deserves the best we can offer." He glanced at Margaret with a look of sincere apology, then turned back to Tom. "We all should have shown more respect. Take care of her meal. It's important." Margaret, ever the kind soul, smiled gently. She had heard Richard's words, but she didn't need special treatment. She wasn't upset, she wasn't angry. She had learned long ago that sometimes things like this happened. People made mistakes. But it was what came next that truly mattered. "I'm not here for special treatment," Margaret said kindly, her voice warm and calm. "I just wanted a quiet meal." Her words were simple, yet they carried weight. She wasn't demanding attention, nor did she want anything out of the ordinary. All she wanted was a peaceful moment to enjoy a meal and reflect on the years that had passed. Just as the silence settled around them, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Margaret looked up to see her son James emerging from the kitchen. He was wiping his hands on his apron, his face tired from the long hours of work. But as soon as he saw Margaret sitting at the table, his face broke into a wide, loving smile. "Mum!" James exclaimed, his voice filled with joy. He rushed over to her and, without hesitation, wrapped her in a tight hug. The warmth in his embrace was genuine, and Margaret could feel the love he had for her in every second of it. "I'm sorry, Mum. I didn't know you were here. I should have greeted you earlier." Margaret returned the hug, her hands resting gently on James's. "Zabak." She felt a quiet peace settle in her heart. This was what mattered, the connection between them. The restaurant, the customers, the noise of the kitchen, none of that could replace the love they had for each other. "I didn't mind," Margaret said softly, her voice steady. "I'm just happy to see you doing well." She pulled back from the hug, looking at her son's face. His tired eyes were bright with concern, and for a moment it felt as if the weight of all the years had lifted. They were here together, and that was enough. Tom, who had been standing awkwardly off to the side, watched the interaction with a deep sense of shame. He had acted out of line, treating someone who had been part of the restaurant's success as though she were no more important than any other customer. He had judged Margaret too quickly, and now he felt the sting of his actions. Margaret looked at him, her gaze soft and understanding. She could see the discomfort on his face, the guilt in his eyes. But instead of anger, she only felt compassion. She had made mistakes too. She had made countless mistakes in her own life, but she had always tried to learn from them to grow. "We all make mistakes, dear," Margaret said, her voice calm and gentle. "But we can learn from them." Her words were not harsh or critical. They were a reminder, a simple truth. Everyone stumbled from time to time. It was how they picked themselves back up that truly mattered. Tom swallowed hard, his face reddening. He had been embarrassed by his actions, but hearing Margaret's words made him feel a little lighter. He nodded slowly, trying to find the courage to apologize properly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes," Tom said, his voice sincere. "I didn't realize who you were, and I should have treated you with more respect. I'm really sorry." Margaret smiled at him, a warm, forgiving smile. "It's all right, Tom," she said kindly. "Just do better next time." Her words were simple, but they held the wisdom of a lifetime of experience. James, who had been watching the interaction with a quiet understanding, turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "Mum," he said, his voice filled with affection, "why don't we have a special dinner tonight? Just the two of us." He looked around the restaurant, then back at her with a gentle smile. "You've been part of this from the beginning. You deserve a moment for yourself, a meal with me." Margaret's eyes softened at his words. She had spent so many years working hard, raising him, supporting his dreams. And now here he was, successful, proud, and offering her a night of peace. She couldn't remember the last time they had truly sat down together, just the two of them. Life had been so busy, so full of demands. "Thank you, James," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I'd like that very much." James nodded, and with a wave to the staff he signaled that the kitchen would prepare something special for them. Margaret could feel the warmth of his love in his gesture, and in that moment she realized something important. She didn't need the world to recognize her. She didn't need grand gestures or attention. What mattered was the quiet, everyday love shared between her and her son. That was the heart of everything. As they sat together at the table, just the two of them, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background. They shared a meal, talked about old memories, and laughed about little things. It wasn't a grand event, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt truly seen, not for what she had done, but for who she was. In that moment, With her son by her side, Margaret felt the weight of the years lift. The restaurant was thriving, James was happy, and they were together. That was all she had ever needed. The end. Message. Sometimes it's not the grand gestures that matter, but the simple moments of love and connection. We don't need to be seen by the world, just by the people who truly matter.